Hello, this is David. I'm sorry it's been so long since I made a video. I've been busy creating more studies and websites, and now I'm writing books about prophecy fulfillment. And I just published a book about the 7th week of Daniel. And in this video, I want to cover a few things that I've learned this year regarding that prophecy. I believe that the 7th week of Daniel is the most important prophecy to understand for two reasons. First, it proves the validity of the Bible and the deity of Messiah, as the prophecy in Daniel 9 gives a 490-year timeline, which was fulfilled by Messiah in exacting detail. Secondly, it's the foundation of the enemy's false futuristic deception, as they proclaim that it hasn't been fulfilled yet, and that it's a future 7-year tribulation period, which is started when the Antichrist supposedly makes a peace agreement with Israel and the Jews. When people teach about the 7th week of Daniel, they focus on Daniel 9, 24 to 27, as those verses outline the 70-week prophecy. Now you can stop the video to read through those verses to become familiar with them, but once you start the video up, you'll see you would have read that it's declaring 3 divisions of time in the 70-week prophecy. There's 70 weeks to begin it, to rebuild the temple and the city, then a 62-week period, and then the final week, which is the 70th week. Prophecy teachers talk about the people, saying that it's the Roman army of Titus or the people of the Antichrist. They talk about the prince, saying that it's Titus or the Antichrist. And they talk about the covenant, saying that it's an Israel peace agreement with the Antichrist. And when they focus on just those 4 verses, then they can insert their interpretations about what those are describing. But proper interpretation of scriptures requires us to take the Bible's definition of those words, especially when they're from the same author, and increasingly so when they are defined in the same chapter. And Daniel gives us all of the definitions in chapter 9. So that's why it's important to read the whole chapter. And you can stop the video now if you want and read the whole chapter so you have that context. But let's start with the people. There's no need to speculate. Daniel told us who they are in verse 24, and we can see that right here. So Daniel is telling you the prophecy is about 70 weeks, which are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. And if you read through Daniel 9, you know that the people are the Jews who are in captivity, and the holy city is Jerusalem. So we can see that's clear. And then also Daniel 9:16 is part of his prayer. And he's just praying for mercy from the Father, and he said, because of our sins and our iniquities of the fathers, Jerusalem and thy people are become a reproach to all that are about us. So again, he's talking about the city of Jerusalem and thy people, which is the Jews, because they were so disobedient that the Father had to send the Babylonians after them to take them captive. So that's what it means by being a reproach. So we can clearly see who the people are in this verse. So we don't have to guess. We don't have to say it's Titus or the Antichrist people. We know who they are. It's the Jews. Next, let's look at the prince. So again, and the prince is referenced in here and here. So again, there's no need to speculate. You know, people cite the people of the prince, and they go, well, maybe that's the Antichrist. But right here in verse 25, it told you who the prince is. It's Messiah the Prince. And it's just a simple understanding that if it defines the prince as Messiah in this verse, then we should understand that the prince in this verse is Messiah. I mean, it says right here, Messiah the Prince, and then Messiah and the prince. And we'll cover this in more detail. But it's just really easy to see who it's talking about. So we have the people, it's the Jews, we have the prince, it's Messiah, and it says the text points to the prince that shall come. Okay, so who's the prince that shall come? Well, it's Messiah the Prince. Verse 25 tells us that he's going to show up after the 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 62 weeks is 62 weeks. So 7 weeks and 62 weeks is 69 weeks. So it's saying that after 69 weeks, Messiah the Prince will come. Same here. After the 62 weeks, which is a 7-week period for a total of 69 weeks, Messiah will be cut off. So it's telling us that Messiah will come in the 70th week of Daniel. So we have a clear definition. Why would we think that the prince is anyone else when it told us that Messiah is the prince? So by that, again, we see the people in Daniel are the Jews and Messiah, and that's it. So now that we see that, we can look at verse 27 and know who the he is. So the he is pointing, the pronoun is pointing back to Messiah, the prince. So what's the nouns here? We got Messiah, we got the prince, we got Messiah the prince. So it's really easy to see that he, in this verse, is pointing back to Messiah the prince, right? So we can see that. It's real clear to understand. So we're not talking about an Antichrist. We're not talking about anything other than Messiah. So let's look at that verse. It says that he will confirm the covenant. So the word confirm tells us that the covenant already existed, right? So it's not a new covenant like the teachers say that the Antichrist is going to make an Israel peace agreement with the Jews. Well, that's a new covenant. This is saying he's going to confirm the covenant, which means it's old. And all we have to do is look at Daniel 4 and see this verse and see that Daniel already mentioned the covenant. So he's talking, just praying to the Father, and basically through that whole prayer, admitting that the Jews had sinned greatly, and he's praying for the Father to keep the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. So we can clearly see that Daniel has already spoken about the covenant, and then here it says he's coming to confirm the covenant. So the covenant pre-existed and Daniel already pointed to it. So the covenant that Daniel is referring to is the covenant that was made to Abraham, the everlasting covenant. When the Father tested Abraham's faith in offering Isaac up as a sacrifice, Abraham was told that the Father would provide a lamb for his sins. Abraham believed that the Anointed One, Messiah, the Lamb of the Father, would atone for his sins. So he looked forward to that event, and we look back on Messiah's sacrificial death for our sins. Daniel knew at that time, that most of the Jews in Babylonian captivity were still living in rebellion against the Father. And you see that played out when you read Daniel 9. They had failed to keep the Sinai covenant, which meant that the Father's wrath was still on them. So Daniel pleaded on behalf of the remnant of Jews, the ones who loved the Father and sought to obey his commandments. He prayed that the Father would use them to bring about the fulfillment of his promises that were made to Abraham. So he knew that the promised Messiah would be the son of David, of the tribe of Judah, which was currently in captivity. He knew that the promised Messiah would be born in Bethlehem and carry out his ministry in Jerusalem, which now lay desolate. He knew that Messiah would ratify the everlasting covenant with his pure blood, which would atone for his sins. So he was praying for the Father to fulfill all those things, to fulfill the everlasting covenant for his people, the Jews. That's the proper context of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 prophecy and the 70th week, which is the pinnacle of the prophecy. So Daniel 9:25 tells us that the promised Messiah would appear after the 69th week, which is after the 7-week division and the 62-week division of the prophecy. So that means that Messiah appears in the 70th week. Daniel 9:26 tells us that Messiah is cut off, and that means he's killed. Not because of anything that he did, because he was sinless, but he did it for our sins, to atone for our sins. It says that this takes place after the 62-week division, which is, you read the text, that takes place after the 7-week division. So again, that confirms that he appears in the last week, the 70th week of the prophecy. Now, Daniel 9:27 tells us that when he died, the text, when you're reading it, so it says, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So it's telling us that when he died, he caused the temple sacrifices to stop. Well, when Messiah died, we can read the Gospels, and the Father tore the temple curtain in two, symbolizing that animal sacrifices were no longer needed. And the separation from us and the Father had been removed as Messiah is our high priest, our intercessor. So we can see that Daniel's prayer has been answered. As Messiah came to confirm the everlasting covenant that was made to Abraham, he ratified it with his blood as the spotless lamb that was sent by the Father. Now, when you read Daniel 9:26 and 9:27, it can kind of seem confusing. And the reason is because it's using an AB format. So in other words, the first part of the sentence is talking about Messiah, right? And then it talks about the destruction of the city. And then this part of it, it talks about Messiah. And this part of it talks about the destruction of the city and the Jews. So A, B, A, B. So it gets confusing, but when you separate it out, you see the picture. So we just went through Messiah's text, but the last part of the text says that it's about the Jews and the desolation of the city. And it says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the people are the Jews, the prince is Messiah that shall come. So Messiah is coming in the 70th week, but the people shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And when you read that, it's saying that the Jews shall destroy Jerusalem and the sanctuary, the temple. And that seems odd at first until you realize what the text is declaring. Verse 27 points to the overspreading of abominations. So it's pointing to the abominations of the Jewish leaders rejecting their promised Messiah and delivering him up to be killed, which deserved punishment. It's pointing to the abomination of the Jewish leaders continuing to offer animal sacrifices in the temple, even after Messiah's one-time sacrifice ended the need for them. That's an abomination. It's pointing to the abomination of the Jewish leaders offering sacrifices for Rome in the temple. Now, that's not in the text, but that's in the fulfillment. And the Jewish Roman historian Josephus documented that. So that's a grievous sin. That's an abomination, making sacrifices for Rome in the temple. And it's pointing to their continued rebellion against the Father as they persecuted Messiah's disciples, and they stoned Stephen to death after he presented legal allegations against them. So Daniel 9:26-27 are proclaiming that because of the Jewish leaders' abomination that the temple and city would be desolated. It says that the destruction will come as a flood, as it did in 70 AD when the Roman army flooded into the city and killed hundreds of thousands of Jews by the sword during the Jewish-Roman War. So this is why Daniel was so distraught for 3 weeks. I mean, he was told the good news, that the Jews would be released to go rebuild the temple and restore the leadership system in order to prepare for the promised Messiah. And then he understood that his people, the Jews, would deliver Messiah up to be killed. And he understood the punishment which would come upon them, which was basically going to be worse than what happened at the hands of the Babylonians. Babylonians desolated the city, took the Jews captive. Now he understood that not only is the temple and the city going to be desolated, but the Jewish nation basically was desolated. The leadership system was ended, and there was no promise, of a future except for the Jews who believed on Messiah. So with Daniel's definitions of the people, the prince, and the covenant, we see the proper fulfillment. We see that it's pointing to Messiah, confirming the everlasting covenant that was made to Abraham, that those who love the Father and believe in Messiah's atoning work are saved. And by that, we see that all the fanciful stories about the 7th week of Daniel being about the Antichrist are without merit. And we see that it's not a future 7-year tribulation period, which destroys the enemy's foundation of their false, futuristic fulfillment explanations of Revelation. Now that's just a summary. It's just trying to lay the foundation for the fulfillment of the 7th week of Daniel. I prove this all out in detail in my 7th week of Daniel 9 decoded book. I'll put a link in the video description where you can link to the book. You can get it in print. You can get it in Kindle version. I hope that helps you see truth about the fulfillment of the 7th week of Daniel so that you understand how it validates the Bible and Messiah's deity, and so that you see that it's not about the end times or the Antichrist. Keep learning and growing in the way and be an overcomer. Amen.